true. I don't need that kind of memory capacity.
I think sometimes it's all right when you're talking about the selection. It's not your...
Do you ask questions though? I find it helps if people ask questions.
Yeah, I'll ask questions. As you did. Okay, let's go. If they're late, they're late. Right, so tonight we've got Dr. Margot Turnbull, who's come in from the English department, actually. Originally a speech therapist.
That's correct, yes.
Australian, so do excuse the language, it's not British.
Sorry about the accent.
And a very good friend of mine as well, so we have to thank her for coming in, because she's actually doing me professional kindness in her coming in tonight to actually talk to you guys. So over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me along. I quite like coming to do this. I did this lecture last year as well, so hopefully tonight will be better than last year and more interactive. Do feel free to ask any questions or for clarification as I'm speaking. Now I understand that we'll go for about 45 minutes and then have a 10-minute break, then have another 45 minutes and another break after that. So I've done a broad outline for the lecture for tonight. So these are the different areas of information that hopefully we're going to cover and come back to. Now I did take a couple of slides out of the one that's on Blackboard because there are some activities and I didn't want you to have the answers before we got to do the activity. So the same information is there, but this outline and then a later slide is additional to the ones that you might have at the moment. Okay, so the topic for tonight is neurodevelopmental language disorders. So we're going to start with some sections or extracts from tests that are commonly done with children and adults to evaluate their language skills. So the reason we're doing these extracts from the tests is so you can start to think about the sorts of skills and what you need to do, the sort of cognitive processing you need to do when you are asked to produce certain types of language. Okay, we're not going to score the tests. So they're extracts from about 3 or 4 different types of language tests, but each of them uses a different set of skills, okay? So the first one, these are a combination of memory and language skills, and all the answers you can write down. Sometimes these tests are done with verbal responses as well, but tonight, because it's a group, we're going to do written answers, okay? So if you have a pen and a piece of paper or a screen you can put the answers on, that's fine. As I said, it's not for scoring, but I will give you some of the answers so you can have an idea of the sort of responses you produced. So the first one we're going to do is an extract from the digit span test. Okay, so I'm going to read a series of numbers and I would like you to write them down in the exact order that I say them. Okay, so I'll start with a short combination of numbers and then the number of digits I say will increase in length. Okay, and there's 2 parts to this test. The first one is when you have to write the numbers down, I say, in the correct order. The second part of the test is when you have to write them down in the reverse of the order in which I say them. Okay? So don't write them down as I say them. Wait till I finish and then write them down. Okay? All right. So write these ones down in the order in which I say them. 4, 3. 7, 9, 2. 5941 93872 152649 3745261 8297 3546 246937185. Okay. So then leave a space under that one or draw a line. The next set of numbers, you need to write them in the reverse order in which I say them. Okay? And try and just reflect on the sort of processing that your brain and your mind is having to do to produce the numbers in the reverse of order in which I say them. Okay? So the first one, 16, 847, 7253, 75396, 216748, 4925316, 6917423, 37162598. Okay, so that's quite a hard task by the time you get down to those longer numbers. Now what I'll do is I'll read the numbers out in the order in which you should have written them down, so you can give yourself a tick for the different numbers, and then I'll tell you what the average, like a good average score would be for that test, okay? All right, so the first set, 4-3, and tick every number that you get right because you get 1 point per tick, okay? The second number, 792, then 5941, 93872, 152649, 3745261, 82973546, 246937. All right, so tally up how many ticks you got in that first set and just write it on the side, and then I'll read out the second set and you'll get a final number. Okay, ready for the second set? So this is the order in which you should have written them down. 6-1, 7-4-8, 3-5-2-7, 6-9-3-5-7, 8-4, 7-6-1-2, 6-1-3, 5-2-9-4, 3-5, 2-4, 7-1-9-6, 8-4-9, 5-2-6-1-7-3. Okay, so count up the ticks you got in the second set and add them together, and then I'll give you an idea of what an average sort of score for an adult would be. Okay, all done? So who got over 5? Hands up if you got more than 5. That's good. So your total score when you add the first and the second set together, over 10 ticks? Anyone? Over 20? Over 30? No? Okay, so it's a very hard test. An average score for an adult is 18. Okay, so if you got 18, you would have a good solid standard score of about 100. Okay, so you'd be in the top percentiles for that. So think about the sort of skills, the sort of language and memory skills you needed to be able to complete that task. They're the sorts of skills that we'll be talking about in terms of neurodevelopmental language disorders later on. Now the next test is a very short one. It's a very common, again, memory and language test. Okay? So I'm going to give you an instruction and you need to complete this task on your paper with your pen. All right? I won't tell you what the test is called until afterwards because then it will give away what you need to do. Draw 2 circles on a page. On the first circle, draw the time as 10 minutes past 11. The second should be 7:15. Okay, so on the first circle, obviously you're supposed to draw the time as 10 minutes past 11. Got it? And then on the second circle, oh, hold on. Oh.
The second one was what?
Have you, I can't repeat it as part of the test though. So I'll give you some more working time. You done? So the first clock should say 10 minutes past 11 and the second clock should say 7:15. Now that test is called the clock face test for obvious reasons, and that's used for a quick assessment or screening of executive language skills. So it looks not just at memory but also the ability to comprehend different levels of information, and then to do something with that information in a written task. Okay, so we'll talk about executive language skills later on as well. Now the next one is a story recall. So again, this is about your memory, but it's also about your understanding of spoken language and your ability to organize and retrieve different elements of language. So we'll just do a very short version of this. I'm going to read you a short story. Now usually when you do this with an adult patient in a hospital, you would ask them to tell you back the story. But what I'm going to ask you to do for this is listen to the story as I read it, and then see how many pieces of information you can recall from the story. So you don't need to write out in sentences, just write down a note or something that's meaningful for you, okay? Sam and Fred were brothers who had farmed the land for 30 years. They had been closely following weather forecasts and knew that the weather was about to change. They had been working frantically in the fields when suddenly the skies opened. Several days of hard labour were disappearing before their eyes as crops were washed away. To add to their difficulties, the storm ripped open the door of the barn. Many sheep and cows escaped. People from the local village arrived to help the two distressed farmers. It was nearly nightfall by the time all the animals were returned to the barn. Let's give you a minute to write down as many pieces of information from that as you can. Okay, so do you have a rough idea of how many pieces of information you recalled from that? There were about 3 pieces of information per sentence, and there were 8 sentences altogether. Okay, so it's about 24 items of information. So when you do that with a patient or someone whose language you're testing, you would take note of how many pieces of information they can remember, and also the order in which they can remember them. If you go back to the digit span test, when you wrote the numbers down backwards, I wonder if it's more usual in those longer numbers that you'll write down the last couple of numbers that are said. So you know, when I gave you the long string of numbers and then said to write them down backwards, you're probably able to write down the last ones that I said in the correct reverse order, because they would have stayed in your short-term memory for longer. And that's often what happens with story retell as well. And that's quite significant when you're assessing language skills. Okay, so again, think about the sorts of things your brains had to do to complete that task. You had to organise information, you had to listen and understand, because you can only recall what you understand and what makes sense to you. So if they were all disconnected sentences, it would be much harder to remember that information. Okay, then the last extract from a test that we're going to do is a picture recall test. So in a moment I shall show you a slide that has a number of pictures on it, and I'll let you look at it for about 30 seconds, and then we'll go back to this slide of the outline, and you need to write down as many items as you can remember. Okay, then I'll show you the slide again, and we'll do another activity based on those same pictures. Okay? Okay, so now write down as many as you can remember. Okay, so it's about a minute of writing time. So there were 9 items on that slide? Did anybody remember 9? Yes, well done. Who remembered between 5 and 8? Yeah, that's quite an average sort of number to remember in that time period. Now I'm going to show you those pictures again for about a minute, and then I'm going to take the slide away. And this time what I want you to do is write down the name of the item or the picture, but then write down 2 characteristics about that picture that you can recall. Okay? So it might be colour, or it might be a semantic category like food or something like that. I won't give you too many clues, okay? Okay, so I'll give you a minute to write down some answers. Okay, stop there because that's 1 minute. So if you were to complete that task perfectly, you would recall 9 items and 2 features of each. So you would be writing down about 27 pieces of information, okay? So when you mark that sort of a test, you would count up how many items somebody correctly remembered, and you would just get a straightforward score. But then you would also look at the sort of features that people wrote down about those different items. So if you take a moment and look at the features that you wrote down about each of those items, or whichever ones you did write down for, can you see any pattern in the sorts of words you used to describe those pictures? Anybody like to tell us what sort of things you tended to write down? If it was me, I would write down the colours straight away. That's the way I tend to organise information in my brain. What else did people write down?
The size.
The size, okay, yeah. As in the size in real life?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. What else could you write down? Or how else could you organise the information? If you were to do it by semantic category, for banana, you'd write fruit, for example. So I would probably write yellow first and then fruit. For flamingo, you could write bird or animal. Same for hedgehog, fish, cat. And although the way that you organise information is very important when you're thinking about language development and then language disorders. So some people who have language disorders might be able to recall the items correctly, but they wouldn't be able to describe them because they have a particular type of impairment, which we'll talk about later. Or they may not be able to give you the name of the item, but they might be able to describe it. They might be able to say, oh, towards the bottom there was something that it was yellow, you have to peel it and then you can eat it, and monkeys like it. But they might not be able to recall the word banana as the correct name for the item. Now, I wanted to start with these sorts of activities because when you talk about language disorders, you need to start by talking about what language is and how language develops as well, because a disorder is about an impairment of a naturally or normally occurring process. So as we go through the lecture and the different sorts of activities, I'll refer back to the sorts of testing that we just did now to relate them to the skills that you have in your language development and then in relation to language disorders. Here are some pictures of different sorts of brains in different types of mammals, and the human brain is quite distinctly different to the other types of brains. If you look at the elephant brain, obviously it looks larger because the elephant is a larger animal, but it also has a much larger motor cortex at the back there, whereas the human brain has a much larger frontal cortex. And scientists think that one of the reasons that the human brain has developed in the way and in the shape that it has is because of our ability to communicate and to learn language in ways that all these other animals can't do. So some animals have much bigger motor cortexes because they're more agile and they're much more physical, so those parts of their brains have developed. Whereas our brain is particularly complex and interesting because there's so much more that happens in the frontal cortex, and that's where language and communication is situated, and the different brain structures that contribute to language. So when you look at the human brain in more detail, there are specific areas that have a really key role in language and communication. So the frontal lobe, as I said, has an important role in terms of planning and organising your thoughts and your language ultimately. And the parietal lobe is important in terms of perception, so how you perceive or how you integrate information about what's happening around you. And then the temporal lobe is important in terms of memory, but the two areas that we talk about most in terms of language development and then language disorder are Broca's area, which is this one here. So a very small area in the centre of the brain, and that's very important for expressive language. So if you see an adult who's had a stroke or a head injury, if the injury or the bleeding has been in Broca's area, then you can predict what type of language disorder that they'll have. And the other area that's very important for language is again relatively small. It's Wernicke's area, and it's very important for the understanding of language. So again, in an adult, if they've had an injury or a stroke or something in that part of the brain, then they'll have very specific language difficulties. Some examples of those sorts of difficulties. If you have an impairment, impairment to that area of the brain can result in disorganized language, but it might still make sense. So if a child was to say, "Mum, car, drive, milk," that might make sense for the context. It might be that the child is going in the car with their mum to buy some milk. Okay, so it still has some meaning. But if you have an impairment in the other area of the brain, then speech can be quite, or language can sound quite good and can be quite fluent, but it doesn't actually make any sense. So for example, the cat chased the orange near the bike. Doesn't make any sense if the intended utterance was the dog chased the ball past the car. And if you look at those types of errors, though, you can see some relation. So ball and orange are both round. So perhaps there was some language processing that happened, but it resulted in language that didn't make any sense even within that context. Now, lots of studies on language development are done on adults who've had head injuries or strokes because they've had language skills and then lost them as a result of something in particular happening. And lots of that information is then retrospectively applied to language development in children. So neurodevelopmental language and communication disorders are quite specific by definition. So it's damage or impairment to the brain at a young age, usually before the age of 7, if not 3 in some definitions. And it's not unusual or disrupted, a disruption to the brain or the areas that are involved in language and communication processing and production. Now, very importantly, and this is why it's very important to talk about language development and normal language development before you talk about disorders, is because that depending when the damage or the interruption to normal development occurs, you'll have very specific and relatively predictable language disorders or language difficulties. Okay, so there could be a disruption or a trauma before the baby's even born that will have an impact on its brain development and ultimately its language development as well, or something might happen after birth in the first period of life that will also affect the child's ability to communicate and to use language. Now, when you start to think about child development and language development in children, it's very important to realise and to understand that a child's brain is not just a replica of an adult brain. So a child may be born with as many neurons as they will have for life, But a child's brain doesn't have all the connections laid that an adult's brain has. So that's why child development and those early years of development are very, very important, because those connections and those synapses are laid, and then it goes through a process of shaping as well. So when a child receives positive reinforcement and positive support in its development, then it will have stronger and healthier and more productive synapses in their brain. So the sorts of things that impact upon brain development include things like poverty, stimulation and the environment in which a child lives. So if a child is neglected, for example, or doesn't have any early stimulation, then their brain will develop in different ways. And also general health. So if a child is born with a well-developing brain, but they suffer from other physical illnesses or diseases, then that may, in the longer term, affect their brain development as well. I'm going to watch a video. This lady gives, a scientist talks about brain development and language development in children. It's quite interesting, but she talks in detail about the pace of development as well, and also the way that the development can be predicted across cultures and society. So no matter what language is spoken or what language a child is learning, their brain will still develop in predictable ways.
So just press the on key.
So what that scientist highlights in that research is the pace of development in a child's brain in relation to language learning, but also the huge impact that environment and stimulation has on the brain of a baby as well. And that's very important to bear in mind when you then start to think about neurodevelopmental language and communication disorders. As I said before, if you interrupt any of that process, it can have serious repercussions on language and communication skills in a child, and then as that child grows into an adult as well. So language disorders are one of the more common sorts of developmental disorders in children. They may occur in up to 1 in 12 children. So if you think about the average primary school classroom that might have about 30 children, there could be 2 or even 3 children in each classroom who might have some kind of language or communication disorder. And that sort of disorder and the difficulties associated with language disorder have really significant implications for a child's life. So language disorders can cause behavioural problems, can impact on learning, can make it hard for a child to learn and participate in educational activities, can have an impact on their mental health as well. So how they feel about themselves, how they feel about life, and their satisfaction with learning. It can also be related to reading difficulties as well. And there are some very interesting statistics based on research that people have done in prison populations. And some research suggests that up to 1 in 3 prison inmates, so people who have been sent to prison for quite serious crimes, actually have some kind of language or communication disorder that may have not been treated or supported, and then led to quite serious sorts of behavioural difficulties or an inability to socialise appropriately. Now, this is just a summary of some of the comments that research and researchers and children as well have made about the sort of impact that language and communication difficulty can have on them at school. They can be victims of bullying because they can't cope socially, they can't problem solve or interact appropriately. They fail at school, they might struggle to adjust to changes in routine. So if you think about how fast and how quickly things can change at school and the sorts of activities that children have to switch between, if a child has difficulty understanding what's happening, then they'll struggle with those sorts of changes as well. They might be very lonely, find it hard to make friends. And then often if a child can't understand what they're being taught, they might switch off and stop listening, and then they may start to act up in class and have behavioural problems as well. So these are sort of difficulties that are often associated with language and communication disorders. As I said earlier, though, it's very important to have an overview of how language develops and how language interacts with communication as well, so you can start to isolate the different types of language disorders that children might have. So the next few slides talk about what communication is and what language is within that broader context as well. So when I'm talking about language, I'm not talking about just your ability to speak and to communicate, but I'm talking about all the other skills that underlie that as well. And one of the really important things about language and communication is to remember that it's an interactive process. So to communicate effectively, you have to be able to say something that somebody else will understand, and you also need to understand what that person is saying back to you Otherwise, it's not interactive communication. And there are various different skill areas involved in being a successful communicator. So as I said, it involves being able to present information, to find words and sentences, to express your thoughts, to pay attention to somebody else with whom you're communicating. So you might speak to them, but then you need to listen and attend to what they're saying back to you. Then you need to be able to understand or to comprehend what they're saying while you're listening. And then you also need to be able to remember what they have said to you as well. If you couldn't remember what somebody has said to you as soon as they've said it, then you wouldn't be able to maintain a conversation, would you? It would become very one-sided. And underlying that sort of interactive communication are skills in terms of attention and listening, as I said, comprehension or receptive language, using spoken language, which is also referred to as expressive language, and then using and understanding non-verbal language. So things like gesture, turn-taking, how close you stand to somebody or how close somebody else stands to you when you're interacting. Then importantly, there's the ability to use speech sounds. So speech is about the production of actual sounds. It's separate to language, and we'll talk about that later as well. And motor speech skills refers to the ability to use muscles appropriately. So if you're familiar with stammering or disfluency, that's a motor speech disorder. And there are other types of motor speech disorders as well that you more commonly see in adults, like dysarthria, where they've had a stroke and then their speech is very slow and laboured, and they might have a lot of trouble forming appropriate sounds. So in this table, I've just sorted the different sort of skills, more specifically under those different stages of communication. So to present information, so that's the ability to give meaningful information to somebody else, you need to have vocabulary skills, you need to have grammatical skills, so you can organise the words into an order that makes sense to the person you're talking to. And then you need to be able to use those speech sounds, as I said. So you need to be able to form recognisable words for the person that you're talking to. And somebody's attention skills relate to their ability to look and to actively listen to somebody who's speaking to them and to stay focused on what is being said. So if you can picture a child who has very poor attention skills, they might be physically standing in front of you while you're talking to them, but they might be quite distracted and gazing off and doing other things while they're standing there. So they're not able to pay attention to you. So comprehension of language, again, depends on vocabulary and your ability to understand the different sentences that get said to you while you're listening. And then remembering is very important. So remembering words and remembering sentences so you can create meaning in your mind. So those test activities that we did earlier, relied on your ability to organise words and information and then to retrieve the words and information when you needed them. So if you think back to the task that had the 9 pictures on the slide, and I gave the example of somebody who might have vocabulary difficulties who would say, oh, I could picture it was yellow, you have to peel it and then you can eat it. So they could organise information, but they couldn't retrieve the word associated with the picture, which was banana. All right, so they're very specific sorts of difficulties. And then the non-verbal skills, as I said, are very important in communication as well. So eye contact, turn-taking, and understanding and using gestures appropriately. Now, all of these skills develop in a relatively predictable order across cultures and across languages as well. And what's very important in terms of any child development area is that they're cumulative skills. So you need the first layer of skill to be able to build on it and develop other skills as well. So if there's something missing, if you think about it being building blocks, if there's a block missing somewhere, then there will be a gap in skills that will affect your development in other areas as well. So this may be of interest for you to read later if you're particularly interested in communication development, but it goes through in very broad terms the sorts of skills and the rough developmental order that children learn them in. Okay, so the very early stage, children are using eyesight, eye contact, just basic sound awareness to start to interact with people. Then over time, that develops into play. If you think of a child of, say, 1-year-old compared to a child of 5 years old, their play is very different. So the 1-year-old will play essentially by themselves. Even a 2 or a 3-year-old, they might pick things up and put it down, or they might make the sound of a truck driving along, whereas a 5 or a 6-year-old at school will interact with other people. They'll start to have stories in their play. Okay? But if they can't do the very basic play at 1 or 2 years of age, then they will struggle with that more complex play as they get into the school age group. And all these sorts of this developmental information is put into these broad developmental norms, which speech therapists often use when they assess a child's ability. So again, this might be something you'd like to read later, but the developmental norms just give you a broad idea of what a child at 1, 2, 3 and 4 is expected to be doing in terms of their language and communication skills. So it relates to the number of words they know, the number of words they say, their ability to understand and follow directions of different lengths. So very, say, 2-year-old, you would expect to be able to understand 2 pieces of information in an instruction. So 2 pieces of information would be something like, go and get your red shirt. So they need to get their shirt and it needs to be red. So that's 2 items of information. Or get your shoes and put them on. So they need to get the shoes, but they also need to put them on. So some children who have difficulties with that type of instruction might go and get their shoes, but not do anything with it. And it might be that they can't remember the second part of the instruction, or they don't understand that the words that you've used. But by the time a child gets into primary school, they need to be able to understand and follow quite long and increasingly complex instructions. So if you think about the sort of information a teacher gives in class, by the time a child is, say, 8 years old, there might be 5 or 6 pieces of quite complex information that they need to understand and remember to follow a teacher's direction in the classroom. So if you think about the sort of difficulties a child with a language disorder might have, if they can't remember and follow the instructions, then they may start to misbehave in class, not because they're deliberately being naughty, but because they don't know what to do. And they'll fill that gap in understanding with inappropriate or disruptive behaviour. I wanted to speak briefly about bilingual and multilingual language development, because that is a very important area, and it's a great skill for people to have as well. And there is a short video that I think illustrates very well how fantastic it is for the physical brain to be learning more than one language. So the other presenter in that previous video did talk about it, and she talked about that very short 2-month time frame when babies' brains stopped recognising the sounds in unfamiliar languages. So if you can learn a second or third language, then you are at great advantage to other people like myself who are resoundingly monolingual, unfortunately. But you can be depending on the age at which you learn another language, you can learn 2 languages in sequence, or you might have one that's your primary language and then you hear the second language through it, so you might still translate into your first language in your brain, but the language learning can catch up over time. But when you look at children with language disorders, if they are bilingual or multilingual, then you do need to take that into account when you're assessing them or describing the sorts of difficulties that they might have.
Margot,
yes.
Can you have a language disorder in your second language but not your first language? Or your first language and not your second?
I think by definition, no, because you would always be primarily tested in what your first language is. So if you had an unusual pattern of development in a second language, it would probably be due to that second language acquisition as opposed to a fundamental neurological problem that would affect both languages. Yeah? Now, having said that, I think I have mentioned to you a boy I did some speech therapy with in Hong Kong, who was very interesting because he was a native Cantonese speaker, but his English was better than his Cantonese, and he chose to speak in English rather than in Cantonese. And he could read quite complex words in English, so he could read the occupational health and safety signs on the doors in English. So his English, and he was only 4 years old, so his English sound awareness was good enough to figure out what the words were and to pronounce them correctly. But his mother said that he chose not to speak in Cantonese at home and couldn't read any Chinese writing either. But I think those difficulties related more to social communication difficulties. So he could read those English words, but he didn't understand what they meant. So his phonological awareness of sounds and letter combinations was very good, but he didn't have any meaning attached to those words. Any other questions about that? Okay. So in terms of language development, this previous information, I intended to show you that it's a very relatively predictable process. It's cumulative, so you need to have some skills so you can build on others. And as I said before, that's important to bear in mind when we start talking about language disorders, because we're going to talk about different types of language disorders and where particular and when certain impairments might occur. So we have a 10-minute break now. Okay, so we'll start again. As I said before the break, this next section of information is about ways of classifying different language processes. And this again is important, just the way I said earlier, it's important that you understand language as a developmental process, because to talk about disordered language, you need to understand the different parts of language that can be disordered. All right. So psycholinguistic model is quite a popular, well-known, very well-established way of thinking about language. And when psycholinguistics think and talk about language, they focus on questions like how is language organized in the brain, and how do children learn what different words mean, how are words represented in the brain. And these are the really important questions that lead into the different sort of categorizations of language disorders. So we're going to do a quick activity, and these next two activities are to illustrate to you this psycholinguistic model of language. And as I said, this then links into talking about different types of language disorders. All right, so I'm going to ask you a series of questions about this, and these questions touch on different ways in which you might organize your language. So, and you can write this down, the answers down if you want to, or you can just think the answers to yourselves. So the first question is, what is this? So you know what this is. Now, what semantic category does this belong to? So as I said earlier, with the 9 pictures, you might think about fruit or whatever. So what semantic category? Can anyone make a suggestion? What semantic category would you put this picture in? An animal? Okay, good. Can you be more specific than animal? A feline? Yes, what else? Any other? There's lots of different answers you could have. So it's not just right or wrong, they're different types of answers. So feline is very good. Domestic, yes, that's a more common one. Now when you look at this picture, what else do you think of? What's the first thing, other than what this is, that pops into your mind? Okay? Now, if it helps, you can note that down, because we'll talk about that in a moment. But what you think of in relation to this will give you a clue of how your lexicon or your internal dictionary is organized. And when you talk about language disorders, children can have very specific disorders in their internal dictionary, and that will show up in very particular symptoms or the way in which they communicate. All right, so now think about the other thing you thought of when you looked at that. Now, what semantic category does that other thing belong to? Does it belong to the same category of felines or domestic animals, or is it in a different category? Okay. Now take a moment and think about, why have you related those two things? So why has this related to the other thing that you thought of? And again, this reflects your individual processing of language. It's not that one way of doing it is right and others are wrong. Now, you might need to write this down, but what 5 words do you think of when you look at this picture? They could be any type of words at all, not sentences, just 5 words that pop into your mind. So this activity is an example of a semantic networking activity. Okay, it's an element of lots of different language assessments that you do with children. It's also an approach to therapy with children who have language disorders as well. Now this is how I responded to these questions. So you may have responded like this or differently. As I said, it's just different ways of doing things. So I looked at that, and obviously it was a cat. For me, the semantic category was animal, then domestic animal. And when I looked at the cat, the first thing I thought of was dog. All right? So dog belongs to the same semantic category. And the reason I thought of dog was because I thought of a dog chasing a cat. Now, the 5 words I thought of when I looked at the picture of the cat were mice, sneezing because I'm allergic to cats, patting, climbing, and mess. And when I thought about why I related those words together for cat, it's because I don't really like cats. because they make me sneeze. I think they climb on things, and I'm not really that keen on patting them either. So looking at those answers can give you quite a bit of insight into the way in which I organise my internal dictionary, but also the information that I attach to cat. So if you think about an old-fashioned paper dictionary that has a single word and then lots of other words associated with it, your internal dictionary is organised in a similar sort of way, but it's very individual to you. All right. Now, cat is quite an easy example. So just quickly, we'll do a harder example. Okay. So what's this? Yeah? You can just call out the answers if you want to. So what semantic category would you put this in? This is quite hard. I wasn't sure what to do. I put geographical features in the end. But again, you could have lots of different things. Could you be more specific? No, I would find that quite hard. What else do you think of when you look at this picture of an iceberg? Any
warming?
Yes.
White bears.
White bears? Yeah. Polar bears? Yeah.
Antarctica.
Sorry, pardon?
Antarctica.
Antarctica, yes. I thought of the Titanic. That's a classic one, which reflects the sort of movies I might have watched or been exposed to.
Personality.
Yeah, maybe.
Don't have a psychologist.
So the next question then is, why do you think that you've related these two things together? So for Lexi, you say global warming, so iceberg and global warming might reflect your personal interest in climate change or something like that, okay? So when you look at this picture, what 5 words spring to mind? Or anything, just the first or second word that you might think of when you look at iceberg. Some people might think adventure or holiday, other people might think cold. Very cold, very undesirable. So I can almost feel the sort of cognitive processes that go on in my brain when I do those sorts of activities. And again, as I said earlier, and this is very important to remember when you think about language disorders, a disorder is an interruption of that process of categorization, of recall, of understanding, and of use, okay? So when you start to think about questions like, why do we call cat a cat? It's a name, a word, a noun, a label, but it's evolved over time. But we know that that picture was a picture of a cat, so it had a semantic representation, so it had meaning. It had a phonological representation, which is the sounds associated with saying cat. So cat has 3 sounds in it, doesn't it? Cat. Okay, so that's its phonological representation. But to say the word cat, I need to be able to use my muscles in the right way to say cat. And then I need to have the correct understanding of grammar to use the word cat in a sentence. So to say it is an orange cat or it is a big cat, I need to know other words and the structures to make meaningful sentences. And then the other element of language use is the way that you write. So some children might have a very specific impairment in their ability to write words. So they might know it's a cat, they might know how to spell cat, but they may not be able to actually form the written representation of the word cat. Okay? So again, all these areas can be impaired, all these processes can be impaired, and that's when you have different types of disorders. Okay, I'll just skip over the next couple so we can get to this discussion of language disorder. Now, I've based this discussion of language disorders on what's in the DSM-5. So as you raised earlier, there are different types and different labels for language disorders, things like specific language impairment, but I'm only going to talk about the ones that are used in the DSM-5. I'm happy to talk about other things if you have questions about other cases or other terminology that you've heard. But these examples, as I said, are based on what's used in the DSM-5. So the DSM-5 talks about 3 different aspects of language: content, form, and use, which are represented obviously in these 3 circles. And this is from the 1970s, so this is a very well established and a very well researched way of talking about language. And the idea is that somebody who is a competent language user and a good communicator can balance these 3 different aspects of language. And so you're situated in the circle there. So you can use language very well, you have good content, and you have good form of language use as well. So then it follows that you can have impairment in each of these 3 areas, which will result in different types of language disorders. Okay? So this is a very brief overview of what content, form and use of language refers to, but it draws in some of the other things that we've already talked about. If you think back to the communication model that I showed you earlier that had things like attention and listening and turn-taking and vocabulary and comprehension, they're all underlying these three circles, okay? So content of language refers to your vocabulary and the semantic meaning of what you say. So again, if you go back to the example that I gave earlier of the banana, so the person who couldn't think of the word banana but did know it was a fruit, did know it was white, did know that you had to peel it, they had some meaning associated with that image, even though they couldn't find the correct word for it. But a good language user has good vocabulary and understands the meaning associated with those different sorts of words. And then form is very important. That relates to grammar and syntax. So how do you take your words and combine them into meaningful sentences? So if you only use single words, for example, if you think about a child who may be 5 or 6 but only uses 1 or 2 words at a time, then they might know a lot of words, but they can't combine them into meaningful sentences. So they could have a disorder in terms of form in relation to syntax and grammar. Then the use of language relates to pragmatics and social communication. So you might have great vocabulary, you might be able to make really good sentences, but how do you actually use language to interact with other people? And autism is the example that people think of most often in terms of an impairment of the use of language. And I will talk about autism later on. Now, when you think about language and children with language disorders, because language is a developmental process, you also need to think about how old the child is and what sort of expectations you have for that child's language development. So it's quite good to keep in mind and quite helpful to keep in mind the markers of starting school and then starting secondary school. So what sort of language skills, language and communication skills, does a child need to have when they get around to starting primary school? So say by 5 or 6 years of age, they need to be able to sit still, listen, attend, concentrate and interact, play well with others. So if you think of the 3 circles, their pragmatics and their social skills, their use of language needs to be quite well developed. They need to understand long instructions, so they need to have good vocabulary. They need to understand a variety of sentence structures as well. They need to be able to speak clearly in sentences. So not perfect sentences, but just sentences that have appropriate meaning for their age and for their context as well. And by the time a child starts primary school, they need to be able to make themselves understood to their family, but also to unfamiliar adults like a teacher. All right, so if a child has difficulty in any of these sorts of areas, then it may be an indicator that they have some kind of language disorder. But communication continues to develop along with language right up to secondary school. So by secondary school age, so about 12 or 13 years of age, children are still learning language very quickly, but the patterns of it have changed. That they can learn new words much more quickly. So say in a science class, they need to learn new vocabulary all the time after just hearing it a few times. They can understand more complex jokes. They can start to problem solve, so explain when things have gone wrong. And, that should be cope. Cope with change to routine. So if the teacher says, well, tomorrow we're not doing PE, we're doing something else instead, then they should be able to incorporate that into their social skills to cope with change and understand what's going to happen. And in secondary school, it's very important that children can ask for help, and that reflects some of their higher level language skills, which I'll talk about as well. But if you think about the sort of conflicts that teenagers can have or misunderstandings, they need to have lots of very well developed language skills to be able to cope with those sorts of problems. And that's important when you're looking at children with language disorders who are having behavioural difficulties at school or socially as well. Have conversations with different groups of people, and this is about pragmatics and social language skills. So secondary school students might speak differently to a teacher than they would to a peer. So they can modify their language to suit the person they're interacting with. And as I said, negotiate and discuss different topics as well. Okay. So the DSM-5 is very clear that a language disorder needs to have begun in childhood. You need to be able to trace it back to onset within those early years. Okay? So it might be that a child could be 10 or 12 or 13 and be diagnosed with a particular type of language disorder, but to be suitable for diagnosis, they need to have had some problem earlier on in life. It may not have been clear what the difficulty was, but it needs to have started early on in life. If it's as a result of, say, a car accident or a head injury, that's not a developmental language disorder. That's the result of acquired brain injury. It's different, it's quite specific. Now, the DSM-5 says that important diagnostic features relate to difficulty in the acquisition and use of language in terms of comprehension, vocabulary, sentence structure, and discourse. And that these difficulties might be evident in spoken communication, written communication, and interestingly, sign language as well. So you could have a language disorder, you could have a severe hearing impairment and use sign language to communicate, but actually have disordered language in sign language. Now, I only know British Sign Language and Australian Sign Language, but they have very specific grammatical markers. So you could actually have a child who uses sign language but can't use grammar in their sign language. Okay, so that's quite interesting. And then the DSM-5 sets out other symptoms of language disorders. Now, it sets out these symptoms in general, but then goes into specific types of language disorders based on the symptoms that you might see in a child. So a child with a language disorder will probably have reduced vocabulary, limited sentence structure, what they call impairments in discourse. So discourse is that ability to sustain an interactive communication with somebody else. All right. So as I said earlier, that relates to things like listening, attending, remembering, staying on topic, things like that. So discourse is ongoing interactive communication. And importantly, language ability is below the chronological age of the child and causes functional impairment at school, in the home, and socially. All right. So have you talked about chronological age versus developmental ages in standardized testing, or shall I touch on that?
We have a bit, whether it's
Okay. So when you do developmental assessments on children, first of all, you note down their chronological age. So you might note that a child is, say, 6 years, 0 months, and then do a series of standardized assessments on them. And when an assessment is standardized, it means that it's been applied to a population, a large group of children or age-matched peers. So it can come up with a rough age equivalent in terms of skill development level. So when you do certain IQ tests, it might come up with an IQ score, but you could also make inferences about the developmental age of that child. And it's the same with language assessments. So if a child has a chronological age of 6 and you do a language assessment of them and their language age is 4 years, then you would describe that as disordered or delayed language development. Okay? And the use of standardized tests is very important in the diagnosis of a disorder. Using a standardized test is supposed to give you some confidence. So you could say confidently that 90% of children who get this result are only 4 years old, but this child is 6. So there's a discrepancy there, or a mismatch between their chronological age and their developmental ability. The idea of functional impairment is very important as well when you're talking about language disorders. A child could have an unusual profile. They might have an awesome, amazing vocabulary, but just average, age-appropriate grammatical structures, but it's not causing them any problem. So functionally, it's not making it hard for them to socialise, it's not affecting their learning. So there's no real productive reason to call that a language disorder for that individual child. And that's what they mean by functional impairment at school. And also you might hear cases of parents who say, well, people think our child has autism, but we don't see any need to have it diagnosed because he's coping quite well in his school context and we cope with it at home as well. So there's no real cause or push to have a diagnosis. It's not making a functional difference to that child's life. Now, there are lots of hypothesized causes of language disorders in children, but not a lot of scientific evidence. And this is important to think about the difference between the diagnosis of language disorders in adults and children. So as I said earlier, an adult who's been normal their whole life and then has a stroke or a head injury might have a language disorder, but there'll be a very clear physiological cause for that language disorder. That's not usually the case in children. Or if you, I think you spoke the other week about things like Down syndrome or syndromes that have certain symptoms and difficulties associated with them that might explain the language disorder. A pure language disorder is not so easy to trace to a physiological cause. So some of the hypothesized causes relate to structural differences in the brain. I was reading something earlier today about the importance of white matter. So white matter in the brain that sits underneath the grey matter. This research was saying effectively works like a train line. So it helps the messages get from one part of the brain to another. So if there's difficulties or deterioration in the white matter, it might stop the messages from travelling around the brain so efficiently. So that could be a cause of certain types of language disorders in children, but it's hypothesized because there's not the physical evidence to prove that. Again, electrical differences and genetic conditions as well. So DSM-5 says that language disorders must occur in the absence of specific neurological impairments. So if a young child's fallen off a bike and got a head injury, then they have a neurological impairment. They would not also be diagnosed with a specific language impairment, language disorder, rather. So in terms of assessing for a language disorder, there's usually 3 phases to the assessment. So developmental checklists and standardized language scales, which are much more commonly used with older school-age children. It's harder to do a standardized assessment on an 18-month-old child, for example. Observation and case history from the parents. Any questions about that aspect or that? Okay. Now, according to DSM-5, as I said, if you think back to those 3 circles and the way they interact, a child can have a language disorder as a result of impairment in either of those 3 areas. We will go back to the circles in a little while. But an expressive language disorder means that their ability to produce language and the associated non-verbal aspects of language is impaired. And the receptive ability refers to how information is received and comprehended and recalled. Okay. Now, it's important that you assess a child's receptive and expressive language skills, because a child could have very good comprehension and receptive language skills, but very badly disordered expressive language skills, or vice versa. Now, I'm going to show you a short video. I may not show you all of it, but it's a video of a 10-year-old girl with a specific expressive language disorder. Okay, so she has normal understanding, normal IQ. She has a well-developed internal dictionary, if you think back to that example that I gave. But she has, and you'll see, a lot of difficulty accessing language and using it effectively. All right? I think that's all. I actually find it quite sad to watch that video. Now, even if you couldn't hear it terribly well, could you see anything that made you think she was struggling to communicate? Any physical signs? Any things that she did? She looked around a lot, she looked up, she looked like she was thinking, she looked like she was trying really hard. And if you could hear any of the sentences that she did say, they were actually correct. They were syntactically and semantically correct. But she was able to convey very little information. And I think that must be a very, very frustrating feeling for a child, to have all these ideas and things that they want to say and that they want to talk about, but for there to be something broken in terms of their ability and their process to convey that message. And that is a very different example to a child who has an intellectual disability or a cognitive delay or an intellectual impairment. So that if you think of a child who has, say, very low IQ, they may not convey very much information in their spoken language, but it might be equivalent to their understanding and their intellectual development. Whereas that girl in that example had average normal IQ, she knew a great set of words, she knew what she wanted to say, she wanted to talk about the Chihuahua that lived in Beverly Hills, but she couldn't. And you can see, I think, a lot of physical manifestation of that frustration that she felt. And I think if you think of that child, and then think of her when she's 15 or 17 or 20, and the sort of implications that type of difficulty has on a child's mental health, on their ability to socialise, and their ability to be safe and independent in their life. It's a really significant sort of disorder for them to have. And that's why all the research and people say over and over again, early intervention is very important, because if you work with a child who has any kind of language disorder, but specifically an expressive language disorder in this example when they're young, then you may not be able to fix the broken process or the disorder, but you can teach them strategies to deal with it, because they have the intellectual ability to adapt and to change and to learn strategies to help themselves. Okay?
Sorry.
Yeah.
And you would have the same impairment on both the verbal and writing abilities?
Yes. But when you think, remember I said before about functional impact. So if you had a child who had that level of impairment in their verbal abilities, even if they could write quite well, it's not a functional communication skill, because you can't, be a teenager hanging out with your friends and writing things down. And also the ability to write meaningful sentences depends on you having developed the ability to speak in sentences. So if you think about the way 5 or 6-year-olds learn to read and to write at school, the writing follows on as a later skill from the speaking and then from the reading, and then they start to write. So it would be unusual to have impairment in one area and not in the other. And in terms of writing, if you think about the way that you correct your own writing, if you write a sentence or a paragraph, then you read it back to yourself and you can find the mistakes to correct. Whereas if you have that type of impairment, it would be very hard to correct your own mistakes in writing as well. In children with expressive language disorders, this is where case histories are so important from parents. Parents might often describe them as late talkers. They were late to start talking. And by 3 to 4 years of age, so just put a comma in what I said there, this is why it's so important to always start thinking about normal language development before you start to think about language disorders. So a child of 3 to 4 years of age should be making sentences of about 3 to 4 words that make sense to their parents and to other familiar adults like older brothers or sisters or grandparents. So a child with an expressive language disorder probably will be described by their parents as a late talker, but they were still very hard to understand when they were 3 or 4 years of age. And that's an unusual thing to hear. If you hear a parent particularly saying, they were 4 and I still didn't know what they said most of the time, that should make you feel like there's something else to investigate. Now, I may understand simple stories, but not to be able to repeat them back. If you think about that story retell activity that we did to start with, where I read you that short story about the farmer and the storm coming and the pigs and the animals getting out, etc. If you had a language disorder, an expressive language disorder, you might remember everything that I've said, but be unable to tell it back. Okay? So again, you start to feel that frustration of knowing that you know something, but being unable to show me or the assessor that you did know that. And again, limited vocabulary, they might have the words in their internal dictionary, but just not be able to express it. And in older children, there are quite specific signs as well. So they might often use the word or to fill a gap, so non-specific language, it doesn't carry any meaning to it, the way that specific vocabulary would. They might also leave out key words, have problems with tense or grammar, repeat certain phrases. So some children who have language disorders get very good at saying certain phrases and they just say them over and over again and they use them to fill a gap. So they know they have to say something, someone's expecting them to say something, so they'll just say something that they've rehearsed and that they've practiced. So their language will be inappropriate and it will lack meaning. And this is the thing I think you saw in that little girl in the video, that she didn't talk very much really in terms of that activity, but understood what was required of her and she had an understanding of what she wanted to say. So might be able to pronounce words quite well, but not be able to form them into sentences. And the result of that, as I said in relation to that video, is that the children get very frustrated and very sad, I think, as well. And when they start to reflect on what they can't do, but what they want to do, then it can cause all sorts of problems socially and at school as well. Now I do have a short video about receptive language disorders, but I might just talk to you about that, just given the time, and it is quite a long preamble for this one. But also receptive language disorders are harder to see So if somebody has a receptive language disorder, they struggle to learn words in the first place. They therefore have a very poor vocabulary. They probably don't talk very much. They get confused. They might just stand there not doing anything when the teacher expects them to go and do something. So I gave the example earlier of saying to a preschooler, get your shoes and put them on. So the child might come back with one shoe or two shoes but not do anything with it. They haven't been able to retain and understand what needs to be said. And then there are very specific supports that you need to give to children. So I don't know if you've seen things like Makaton, so keyword signing. Do people know what Makaton is?
We've had great discussions on Makaton because it's a very specific thing to. Who was my Makaton? We were talking about Makaton within Cantonese language.
Right.
Yeah.
So tell me about that. Does Cantonese have its own?
I believe so, because it looks like Makaton is like derived from like that country or area's sign language.
Mm-hmm.
Because like like as you said, like there's like Australian sign language, British sign language, American sign language. So but once they derive it from that area, it will be like official for the whole area.
Oh, okay. So they use the Cantonese version in the same way in terms of keywords to support understanding. So one of the important differences between British or Australian or American Sign Language and Makaton is that Makaton doesn't have any grammar attached to it. All right, so it's called keywords literally because you would support one phrase or one sentence of what you're saying with one or two keywords. Now, if I think for a moment, I might be able to give you an example. So usually with very young children, you would do it with the sorts of objects that they have with them every day, and you teach them Makaton in a very familiar context, like perhaps having a meal. So if I was to say to a child, would you like to have a drink? That's how I would say it verbally. To use Makaton, I would say, would you like to have a drink? So I'm using the sign to support the action, one of the key words. And then once they've had their drink, I might say, would you like some more to drink? But using Makaton, I would say, would you like some more to drink? Or are you finished? And so finished and finished. I think that's the Australian one, that's the British one. There are some minor differences, but the general principle of it is the same. So Makaton signing doesn't replace spoken language, whereas official British Sign Language does. So if you look at somebody who is using sign language, if they have hearing impairment, they're using sign language, they won't speak. They will only use sign language. That's their official way of communicating. Whereas Makaton is always a support to spoken language. And I think Makaton is a very good example of how to help receptive language difficulties. So again, the example, would you like to have a drink, means that you need to be able to understand and recall the words that I've said, but also be able to get meaning from them, which if you have a receptive language disorder would be difficult. But if I support your understanding by using a gesture that's very functional and related to what you do with your cup or your glass, then that would help the child who has a receptive language disorder. Does that make sense? Now, about 20 years ago, I could have given you an example in British Sign Language receptive, but all I can think, I used to be able to say Mary had a little lamb, but when you watch somebody signing properly, they have all sorts of grammatical markers, so the sentence is grammatically perfect. And it fulfills every function that spoken language has as well in terms of the 3 circles, content, form and use. So you could be using sign language but have inappropriate social skills with it as well. Or you could be effectively yelling but in sign language, or not waiting your turn, or not attending to what the other people signing back to you are doing as well.
It's classified as a language.
Yes, that's right, it is.
So it has the same impact on if you're learning sign language and another language. It has the same impact on the brain development as another verbal language.
That is an interesting question. Do you mean if you were a child who was deaf and you were being taught sign language from an early age, would it have the same effect on your cognitive development, your neural synapses?
Or if you're not deaf, you have one language, one verbal language, and instead of learning another verbal language, you learn sign language. Would that have the same impact on the brain?
Yes. So when I learnt sign language when I was an undergraduate, I effectively did it as a second language learner. So again, if you think back to the bilingual model, I was filtering everything through my verbal language. So Mary, for example, I could sign out, and then had. but I had to first think it and then translate it into sign language. So yes, a similar process. Yeah, I think it would be very interesting to be able to assess and to understand a language impairment in sign language. So somebody who was a signer, if they had an expressive language impairment, to look at the patterns in their actual signing that were impaired. But I can't do that. That would be very complicated. So receptive language disorder, and I find this diagram here quite helpful as well. So receptive language disorder is essentially in here, so where that lexicon and where your words are stored. Expressive language disorder relates to the output stage of it. So you've got everything intact in here, but you just can't use it effectively. Now over here in terms of input, if a child is deaf or has an undetected hearing loss, they'll have difficulty learning language, but for a physical reason that can be corrected. You also have disorders called central auditory processing disorders, which are in the DSM-5, I think, but they're a slightly different category of disorder. But what they refer to is normal hearing, so the information goes in, but something happens neurologically as that information gets turned and stored meaningfully. But it's different to a language disorder. So a child with a receptive language disorder may seem uninterested in what is being said because they don't understand. They may rarely ask questions or make comments, again because they're not understanding what's being said, so they can't comment or ask questions about it. Be seen to have poor listening and attention skills, struggle with following directions, and misunderstand what is said. And I think you can see from those kind of difficulties how that might look in a classroom context as well. It might be a child who seems to be disruptive and naughty and non-compliant, but it could be explained by the fact they're just not understanding what is being said. And that's why assessment is very important, because there will of course be children who are naughty and non-compliant but don't have language disorders. So children with language disorders are very much worthy of being supported so they can have access to education and those opportunities as well. So the DSM-5 talks at length about receptive and expressive language disorders, and then they also talk about other associated conditions with language as well. And one of the categories they use in the DSM-5 is they refer to people who are considered late talkers. So they might be diagnosed with a language disorder later in life, as they're older, but they've had some level of skill development. That means they haven't been diagnosed with a language disorder, by 7, between 4 and 7, which is probably the usual sort of age for diagnosis. But they might have had indicators that would have been of concern in retrospect. They might have had limited vocabulary, so fewer than 50 words by 18 months of age. They might have also had delayed comprehension skills or had a family history of language impairment, and those difficulties persist into school years and get worse over time as well. Now, one of the categories that is very interesting to everybody is social communication disorders. So, as I said earlier, this is an impairment or disordered use of language. All right, so the child might have intact content and form of use, but very specific impairment of pragmatic and social communication skills. So DSM-5 defines it as a primary deficit in the social use of non-verbal and verbal communication. So the examples they give are greetings. I don't know if you can think of children to whom you might say hello. They don't say hello back, or they don't make eye contact. They need to be taught how to do it. And it can seem relatively minor, but within the context of social interaction, it's actually very important that children can do that. And also an awareness of what a listener needs from an interaction as well. Now, I did have an activity to illustrate social and pragmatic communication difficulties. I am aware of the time. Should we do an activity then have a break?
Yeah, we don't need a long break.
Okay. All right. So I thought this could be fun, a little bit noisy to do. In groups, do it however you like, pairs or threes or whatever. But I'd like you to get into small groups, and then what I want you to do is to have a conversation in a small group about anything, but something that requires interaction. So you might start it by saying something like, "Tell me where you went on your last holiday." Okay? So the person has to speak back to you. You need to listen and actually engage in an interactive conversation with them. But I'm going to give one person in the group a piece of paper that has some examples of what it would mean to have a pragmatic or social communication disorder. Okay, so without showing the other people, I'd just like you to do some of these things, obviously respectfully, and then just think about the impact that it has on your interaction within your group. Okay, so again, a group of any size, but it does need to be interactive, so 2, 3 or 4. Okay, so once you've got into your little groups, if you just put your hand up so I know where the groups are, I'll make sure I give one person only in that group. Yep. Yep. Okay. So, no, no. So you group 4? Who would like this? Yeah. Who would like this? Okay. Who would like this? Okay, so once you're in your groups and you have your piece of paper, have your conversation, your interaction, but just be prepared to feedback to the group about how it impacts on you. Do you need? Oh, 45 out of 59. That's not that many, is there?
Well, why don't you do the first 2 and then just go over the others?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I was looking through autism and ADHD.
I've just found a really good journal article on intellectual disability and language.
Ah,
So I might put that.
maybe I'll go through this. Do you think it's worth showing the stuttering one?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so I'll go through that, then if there's time, maybe I'll do those. Okay.
Because, yeah, I mean, this is all just the comorbid dual diagnosis, as it were.
Yeah.
Because they might enjoy that. Yeah, that stuff.
Oh, that's
And the stuff.
okay. Okay, I think that's long enough. Thank you very much. Has everyone had a chance to have a conversation as a group? Yes? All right, so those pieces of paper that I gave you had examples of the sorts of things a child with pragmatic or social communication difficulties might do. So if we just have some comments, how did you find it in the front row here? It's a very animated discussion. Was it easy to work out what the other person in the group was doing wrongly, and what impact did it have on your conversation?
They just ignore me. I feel like I'm
Like bullying.
Yeah, I
Yeah?
feel like bullying.
Yes. So you felt quite ignored?
Yeah.
Yeah? And what sort of behaviours were you displaying? Were you refusing to make eye contact or?
I don't make eye contact. I just like, hey, what are you doing?
Yeah. Okay.
And then I'll ask like, during her conversation about her day, I was like, what's your name of your boyfriend? And like everybody just like.
Okay. So you felt quite left out, quite socially excluded. What about in the second row there? Do you have any comments to add to that? How you found the interaction, or was it quite difficult? Was it? Yeah. Was there anything else about that? Sorry, I can't hear. Sorry. Yeah? Yeah? Okay, so if you think about your experience of that conversation, how do you think that might... Sorry, how do you... Was that too exciting an activity? So again, here at the front, how do you think that might affect children of school sort of age?
Like they must be like frustrated because they want to express themselves, but no one's listening.
Yeah. So they might feel quite frustrated. So what about this group at the front here? What do you think?
I think when I interrupt them, someone will appear face of impairment or like
Yeah. So they might be embarrassed. Do you think, how would that affect a child socially, do you think, at school? If ostracized, yes, definitely.
So I tried to talk, and then because she was not responding to me, then I think I wanted to ignore her.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. They can feel very ostracized, as though nobody's listening to them. And that would then have an impact on their mental health, wouldn't it? Their self-esteem. Their self-esteem and how they feel about themselves as well. Okay, so that was an example of pragmatic difficulties. So I think we'll have a break. Should we have a break now? So if we resume at 1:45 on that clock. Thank you. So if they're just links in the slides, if I like them,
In what?
Sorry. You know how before you had to take the ones that I'd embedded and put them into that slide thing that you did. If they're just links like that, it doesn't matter. Okay, no, that's all right.
But I can, if you just highlight it, copy it, and I'll just put it on the YouTube.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay, no.
This one?
No, not that one. Just the stuttering one.
That one?
Yeah, that one.
That's already there.
Oh, is it?
Yeah. That's good to go.
Okay. You're a genius.
I don't know, you must have done it before. Where do you want to go from?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, last half an hour.
Okay, as Lexi said, we've got about half an hour left. So after the excitement of the Pragmatics activity, we won't do any more of that sort of stuff. So the next few slides that I have talk about language or disorders associated with disorders of a language that are also in the DSM-5. Now you can read the slides in more detail, obviously, if you want to in your own time, but I'll just go through a few of the different disorders. Now the disorder that has been very high profile in the last 20-ish years is autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, and the incidence rates of autism have exploded or skyrocketed in recent years. So historically, diagnostic rates for autism were 4 people per every 10,000 people, and more recent estimates are that between 15 and 20 people per 10,000 are now diagnosed with autism. And there's lots of debate about why that is, whether it is actually some kind of physiological change that has increased in frequency that is causing it, or whether it's just that there are people who could have been diagnosed 25 or 30 years ago if the same diagnostic categories and criteria were used, but there's no categorical evidence or proof of which is correct. Now, I think you have talked about autism before, haven't you? So there's just a bit of information there taken from DSM-5, and autism used to be diagnosed based on the triad of impairments, and what's different about the DSM-5 is that it focuses on 2 areas of impairment for diagnosis of autism. So the first area is that they must have pervasive and sustained difficulties with social communication and social interaction. So do you know what that means to have persistent and pervasive? So the child has the difficulty across all circumstances and all settings. So you might come across some children who have difficulties at school, but they don't have the same difficulties at home. So they don't have pervasive and consistent difficulties in that particular area. And then the restricted or repetitive patterns of behaviour is the other diagnostic feature for autism. Children with autism may also have a language disorder that can be diagnosed separately that is not part of the autism. You might also see a child who has a diagnosis of autism but who has fantastic language. They might have an amazing vocabulary, they might be very high functioning, they might be some of these incredibly gifted scientists or politicians who have been known to have autism in the past, but they won't necessarily have a language disorder. But ASD does have a significant impact on language and communication. So children with autism often present as very self-absorbed, have poor social skills. They may have delayed language development. So that's a spelling mistake. And they may have limited verbal language skills as well. So that might be a child who has autism and an expressive language disorder. So the same diagnostic features would need to be present for a diagnosis of expressive language disorder in a child who also has autism. Any questions about language in relation to autism? It's very complex and hard to put into a nutshell, but you can separate out language in the way that we've been talking about it. Language disorder is separate to autism as a diagnostic category. Now, intellectual disability is often associated with language delay or language disorder as well. Now, one of the important things to think about, particularly in relation to children with intellectual disability, is the difference between a delay and a disorder. So a disordered pattern of development means a child might have strengths in one area, so they might have really good receptive language skills, but very poor expressive language skills. And then they might have very good social communication skills. So it kind of goes up and down in a line like that. But a child who has a delay will have poor receptive language skills, poor expressive language skills, and then poor social communication as well. All right, so if you think a disordered line is up and down, but a delay is just straight across the board low-level development. So in children with intellectual disability, they're more likely to have a language delay. So their language skills will be commensurate with their intellectual abilities. Okay, so if their chronological age is 6, but they have an intellectual ability level of a 4-year-old, then their language will probably be that of a 4-year-old as well. So that's a delay, and that's different to a language disorder. Okay, so they might have associated difficulties in language, but not necessarily a language disorder. Now, language difficulties are also associated with ADD or ADHD, and they're very interesting types of language skills. When I spoke at the beginning about the frontal lobe and the executive functioning and higher order language skills, they're the skills that are most often impaired in children with ADD or ADHD. And they, I'll show you the next slide about ADD and ADHD. And again, executive skills are hard to describe in some ways, but it's like the more advanced level of processing. So if you think about how you problem solve, when you look at young children, if they're fighting over who gets the blocks, they sort it out in a very basic way. But as you get older, you have to negotiate and problem solve in more subtle sorts of ways. So you have to try and understand conflict and use language much more flexibly. And they're what you call higher level language skills, and they're often disordered or can be disordered in children with ADD and ADHD. And some of the examples that you might see, the children struggle particularly with science. The language that is used in science is very conceptual and becomes very complex. And children with ADD or ADHD might have difficulty understanding language at that much higher sort of level. So they might be able to use basic vocabulary and function quite well, but then when they get into that more demanding sort of language task, they find it more difficult. So again, cause and effect relationships. So a picture like the boy pushed the other boy off the bridge. Why do you think he did that? They might find it hard to answer why questions, but they might find it easy to describe what happened or when it happened. So they're more concrete in their thinking. Retelling a story. So if you think back to that story retell task that we did, if I read you that story and then asked you to tell it back to me in your own words. So So you have to understand and remember all the information, but form it into original sentences. That's a much more complex task than just asking you to tell me the bits of information that you can remember. Now, I just wanted to touch on speech production, which is not a language disorder. So disordered or delayed speech production is a difficulty in terms of articulation and the physical ability to make different sorts of sounds and form them into words. So that is different to language, which, so if you think back to content, form and use circles, that's all about language and social communication. You could have fantastic language, but your muscles may not work properly, so you might have speech difficulties. So an actual physical difficulty forming the speech sounds that you need. And these are not uncommon. You need to use at least 14 sets of muscles to make the variety of speech sounds that we use in common languages. And a child could have delayed development of those muscles. They might have weak muscles, or they might have a disability like, say, cerebral palsy, which is a motor disorder that means those certain muscles simply don't work. Okay? Now, voice difficulties, I'm not going to talk about at all because that's a completely different conversation. But when people talk about speech and communication, they sometimes talk about voice difficulties as well. Some people lose their voices, or the muscles in this part of their neck don't work properly to produce sounds, but that's a different category. So in terms of speech difficulties, speech delay is common. So as I said earlier, speech and language skills develop in a relatively predictable order, so you need to have the fundamental skills so you can develop other things as well. Now, research suggests that across languages there are some shared early developing sounds. They're usually the very visual sounds, so in English it would be P, B and M sorts of sounds that you often see in children's babbling, so ba 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 ba, those sorts of things. So they're the sounds that a baby can see you as the adult making, and then they'll copy those sounds. All right, so they're the early developing sounds. And I can only speak about English with specific examples, unfortunately. But in English, vowels are the later developing sounds. So if you think about the noises that babies make when they babble, it's all what we call the consonant sounds to start with, the very visual ones, and then over time it becomes the vowels and then the harder, more complex sorts of sounds.
That's what Sandra was saying last week with autistic children. They were making vowel sounds.
Oh, okay. So that's a disordered pattern. Yes. So if it's a disordered pattern, it means that they're not following that predictable developmental route. That's interesting. So did she say that they develop the consonants later?
No, whatever is the easiest ones.
Oh, okay. That's interesting. So speech disorder is something like that. It's a very good example when it's an unusual pattern of development. Okay. Now the other category of speech disorders are motor speech disorders. Now these are less common in children, but these disorders you see quite often in adults who've had things like strokes or accidents, because it's an actual physiological damage to part of their brain. So dysarthria is an impairment, another spelling mistake, sorry, or weakness of the muscles involved. So in an adult who's had a stroke, I don't know if you can picture an adult who's had a stroke whose talking might be very slow and very laboured. So they know what they want their muscles to do, but their muscles are not very cooperative. They're not doing what they want them to do. And dyspraxia, which you do see in children, developmental verbal dyspraxia in children, is a lack of coordination in the muscles. So children, physiotherapists and OTs often see children who have a limb dyspraxia, so they're very uncoordinated. The same principles apply to the speech muscles that you use as well. Now, stammering, stuttering, disfluency, lots of different names for it. It's a motor speech disorder. And I'm going to show you a video which is taken from the movie The King's Speech, and it's just a short segment, but you can actually see, and obviously it's an actor displaying it, but the physical difficulty that he's having in producing the speech sounds. So again, his language is very good, he knows what he wants to say, he has all the words and the sentences he needs, but the difficulty that you can see is with his muscles and in his planning.
And no one would give a damn. Please.
Okay, we should probably stop there. Are people familiar with that movie and the story shown in it? So it's is it King George, who had a very bad stutter? But the therapy, the speech therapy that doctor did with him was very interesting. Went through a process of teaching him to sing first. So people who have very bad stutters can often sing fluently. So they stutter when they're trying to speak, but not when they're singing. So their muscles have the ability to make these words and sounds, but there's something that makes it particularly difficult when they're trying to speak. I don't know if you picked it up then, it was quite quick, but there are a few phrases that he could say very smoothly, like no thanks, and he said only my family call me Bertie. And that's what you often see in people who stutter, is that there are some phrases they can say extremely well, but when they're saying new or spontaneous sentences or conversation, it's very difficult for them. Now, he had some very physical symptoms of his stuttering, didn't he? What did you notice in terms of what he did when he was trying to speak? Because they're quite common amongst people who have stutters. What did you notice about his face or his neck? There was a lot of tension. You could almost see him kind of trying to physically get the word up in a way, get the muscles ready to do it. And a lot of people who have stutters, a lot of children have stutters. There's what you call a normal developmental stage of disfluency that some children go through, usually between the ages of about 2 and 4, and it's often related to how quickly they're learning their language. But people who have a stutter that persists through adolescence and into adulthood describe it as a very upsetting thing to have to deal with, very debilitating sort of condition as well. So again, it's something that's very important to pick up on and to have the right support, because it can be treated, but somebody who has a long-term stutter, it needs to learn how to manage it, because it probably won't be able to be fixed. But as I said earlier with the example of the young girl, the 10-year-old in the video, when people have good intellectual abilities and good language, then they can learn how to manage certain types of difficulties that they might have. Anybody have any questions about any of the content I've covered in terms of language disorders or language development? It's quite a lot, and there are some references, selected references on the last pages if you would like to go away and read anything. Shall I try these, or do you think that's... Okay, and I'll put together a few case studies that I thought might be a good way to finish, or something you could take away with you and read. But these case studies are based on the information in the DSM-5. So the way they're set out is that there's a short paragraph of information, and then there's questions about, what do you think about their receptive language skills, or their expressive language skills, or their social and pragmatic. So the idea of this was, I thought you could just read through the paragraphs and just talk about where you think the actual area of impairment might be. In some of them it's really obvious, in some of them it's not, but that is often what happens with children in real life as well. It can often be very hard to pinpoint where a particular disorder might be. So if I give these out and maybe spend 10 minutes talking about them, if you're not clear about any information, just read through. There are some there that are more straightforward to read than perhaps some of the others. But if you do have any questions, do let me know, and then I'll just quickly finish up after that. So again, maybe in pairs, talk about it in pairs or threes, whatever.